The bombardment began at 4:47 in the morning local time. I know this because I was already awake, sitting at a calibration terminal in atmospheric station 9, watching a pressure anomaly crawl across my monitor in a slow green line. My coffee was still hot. The double moons of Kepler's reach were low on the horizon, painting the red soil in a pale silver light that I had always found beautiful. I was 23 years old. I had never seen a weapon fired in anger. Within 40 minutes, everything and everyone I had ever loved on that planet would be gone. There was no warning, not a single transmission, not a demand, not an ultimatum, not even the cold formality of a declaration. The Velcaran Empire did not waste words on species it did not consider worth addressing. The first sign was a shadow. 200 warships dropping out of fold space simultaneously produce a gravitational shudder that you feel in your teeth before you see anything on any instrument. I remember gripping the edge of my console because the floor swayed, and then I looked up through the station's observation panel at a sky that had been clear and star-filled, and it was full of ships. They were enormous. They were silent. They were already in formation. I pressed the emergency colony alert with my left hand while my right hand was still holding my coffee mug. I remember that detail because it seems absurd now. The mug had a small painted picture of Earth's coastline on it, a gift from my mother when I left for the colony. I set it down very carefully, as though being careful still mattered. The first orbital strike hit the main colony hub, 4 kilometers from my station. I felt it as a concussion of air, a pressure wave that cracked 2 of my observation panels and threw me sideways off my chair. By the time I pulled myself up and looked out, there was a column of fire where the hub had been. Not smoke, not debris. Fire clean and total, the way a thing burns when it is being removed rather than destroyed. That distinction came to me later, much later, when I understood what the Velcaran expansion program actually was. At the time, I only knew that the hub was gone and that 40,000 people had worked there on the morning shift. I ran. I am not ashamed of this. There was nothing else to do. The station's emergency protocol directed all personnel to sub-level maintenance tunnels, which were reinforced against atmospheric events, and as it turned out, provided just enough protection against secondary pressure waves. I went down 3 flights of stairs in near darkness, following the emergency strips on the walls, and I found 11 other people already in the tunnel. A hydroponics technician named Owen, a water treatment supervisor named Clara, 8 others whose names I learned in the hours that followed and have never forgotten. We heard it for 6 hours. The strikes were systematic. There was a rhythm to it, a horrible organized patience. Not random, not furious, not even efficient in the way that a battle is efficient. It was methodical, the way you clean a surface you want to use afterward. I sat in the dark with my back against a cold metal wall, and I listened to Kepler's reach being erased, and I held the coffee mug with both hands because it was the only thing I had left to hold, and I counted. I do not know why I started counting. Perhaps because my mind needed something to do, other than understand what was happening. I began counting the strikes by sound. By the time silence came, I had reached 847. That number would eventually appear on page 1 of the document I spent the next 18 years building, cross-referenced with the Velcaran's own records, which would confirm 900 individual orbital impacts on Kepler's reach in a 6-hour window. The silence when it came was worse than the noise. Owen was the first one to speak. He said in a very quiet voice that he thought it had stopped. Clara told him to wait. We waited another full hour, then we climbed up. There is no way to describe what Kepler's reach looked like from the ridge above Station 9, without resorting to language that does the reality a disservice by making it sound dramatic. It was not dramatic, it was simply absent. The colony was gone. The farms were gone. The roads, the schools, the water towers, the little library that had been converted from a cargo container, and that had a painted mural of a night sky on its sidewall, the weekend market where people sold handmade things and argued cheerfully about prices, the park where children played near the eastern irrigation channel, absent. The red soil was darker where the strikes had hit, and there were fires still burning in a few places, but they were small and purposeless now, like candles lit in a room where the celebration had already ended. My mother had lived in the main residential district, 63,000 people in that district. I did not go and look, I did not need to. Owen found the emergency beacon equipment in a storage locker near the ridge. It took us 2 hours to assemble it because 3 of us, including me, kept losing focus and having to stop and breathe. Clara was the steadiest. She read the instructions aloud in a calm voice and directed each step with the precision of someone who had decided that this one task was the thing keeping her functional. And she was not wrong. We activated the beacon and we sat in the wind and we waited. The ship that found us was not a human vessel. It was a Velcaran civilian cargo freighter, a broad flat thing the color of pale stone, running a resource survey route through the system. It received our beacon and diverted to investigate, not because its crew had any particular interest in our welfare, but because an active emergency beacon in a system flagged as recently processed was a procedural irregularity that required logging. They landed a small craft and 3 crew members came out. They were tall, thin, gray-skinned, with eyes that were wide and pale and did not blink the way human eyes blink. They looked at us with an expression that I would later come to recognize as the standard Velcaran response to encountering a member of a processed species. Mild surprise at the existence of survivors, followed almost immediately by a kind of bureaucratic inconvenience. One of them spoke to another in their language, and the other made a note on a handheld device. Then they gestured for us to board. They let us live. This was not mercy. Mercy would have required them to consider us fully. What they did was something closer to the decision you make when you find an insect on your desk, and decide it is less trouble to carry it outside than to deal with it another way. We were not worth the paperwork of anything else. They gave us a small compartment at the rear of the cargo hold. They gave us water and something edible that tasted of nothing. They did not speak to us again for 11 days, until the freighter reached a Velcaran transit station where a human commercial vessel was docked, and they transferred us across with a brief data note attached to our temporary transit permits. The note described us as biological remnants recovered from Kepler's Reach post-processing zone. I kept that note. I kept everything. When I arrived back on Earth 6 weeks later, I was taken to a medical facility, then to a government office, then to a large room where several people in formal clothing sat at a long table and looked at me with expressions of careful, controlled grief. They asked me questions. They needed my account. I gave it to them precisely, in order, with the numbers I had counted and the details I had retained, and they wrote things down and asked follow-up questions and treated me with great kindness. And when it was over, one of them, senior official named Philip Garland, leaned forward and asked me what I wanted. What outcome I was hoping for. I told him I wanted time. He frowned slightly. He asked what I meant. I said I wanted time to count all of them, every colony taken, every species the Velcaran had ever cleared from a world they wanted. I wanted the complete number. I said this without drama or particular emphasis. I said it the way you announce a project you have already committed to. Philip Garland looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the others at the table. Then he looked back at me and asked gently whether I had been offered psychological support. I told him I had. I told him I still wanted the number. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they do not understand but have decided not to argue. He said that the council would allocate me whatever archival access I needed. I thanked him. I picked up my bag. I walked out into a gray morning in a city that was still whole, still loud, still full of people going about their days, and I stood on the pavement for a moment and thought about my mother's name in a column labeled Units Removed. And I made myself a promise that was not about anger, and not about grief, and not about anything as simple as revenge. It was about the record. It would always be about the record. I went home. I opened my work terminal. I began. 18 years is a long time. It is long enough to learn 3 dialects of a language that was not designed for human vocal anatomy. It is long enough to read 400 years of academic publications from a civilization that does not know you are reading them, because they have never or considered you a threat worth monitoring. It is long enough to build something so thorough, so sourced, so carefully constructed from materials that your subject left lying in plain view, that when it is finished, it cannot be argued with. Not factually, not once. I did not become a soldier. People expected that, I think. After Kepler's Reach, after the loss of Proxima Station 2 years later, and the Callahan Belt settlements 3 years after that, the public conversation on Earth was almost entirely about defense. Warships, weapon systems, alliances with other small species who were equally outmatched and equally afraid. I understood the impulse. I did not share it, not because I was naive, but because I had looked at the Velcaran military capacity in the open literature and done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was not kind. Humanity could not fight the Velcaran Empire the way you fight a war. They were 4,000 years old. Their fleet was the size of some nations' entire populations. They had resources we could not imagine, and motivations we had not yet fully understood. What they did not have was an enemy who was keeping the books. I worked from a small office in a building that housed several other academic research projects, none of which knew exactly what mine was. My official title was Senior Archivist, Human Interplanetary Memory Project. which sounded bureaucratic enough that no one asked many questions. My funding came from a quiet line in the council's cultural preservation budget. I had 2 assistants at various points over the years, a young man named Colin, who left after 3 years to take a university position, and a woman named Frances who stayed for 9 years, and who I consider the closest thing to a partner this work ever had. Frances had a gift for pattern recognition that was almost frightening. She was the one who first identified the administrative template structure in the Velcarin clearance authorizations. That discovery saved us approximately 2 years of work. The Velcarin academic archives were open. This is the thing that still strikes me, even now. They were simply open, available on the Galactic Information Network. Browsable, searchable, cross-referenced, and indexed. Because the Velcarin had been producing scholarship for 4 millennia, and they were justifiably proud of it, and it had never once occurred to them that a species they had classified as pre-political might access it, might read it in their original language, might use it to build something. Their openness was a product of their certainty about what we were. We were nothing to be concerned about. You do not lock the door against the wind. I learned their language first. This took 4 years, working with a linguistic package developed by a human academic who had studied Velcarin trade communications, supplemented by immersive listening to their public broadcast material. By year 3, I was reading their academic journals with moderate fluency. By year 4, I was reading their internal policy papers, which were not secret, merely dense, the way legal documents in any civilization tend to be dense. They were written by bureaucrats, for bureaucrats, and they had the flat, affectless tone of people who had been doing administrative work for so long that the subject matter had ceased to carry any moral weight at all. The expansion program was documented exhaustively. This was the first thing that struck me. There were intake reports, resource assessment reports, biological survey reports, clearance authorization documents, post-clearance verification reports, and follow-up resource extraction reports. Every step of the process, for every world, for every species, going back 31 generations of the imperial line, filed, categorized, and accessible. Because to the Velcarin what they were doing was not a crime. It was a process. Crimes are hidden, processes are documented. The Kepler's Reach file was in the Colonial Expansion Division archives under a reference number that translated roughly as Frontier Zone 14. Biological Interference Case 7841. I found it on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember this because I had made tea, something I rarely did during work hours, and the tea was still steeping when the file opened on my screen. The file was 47 pages long. It contained a full resource assessment of the planet, including atmospheric composition, mineral deposits, and agricultural potential. It contained a biological survey noting the presence of a Category 4 sapient species with rudimentary interstellar capability, and an estimated population of 1.2 million units at time of survey. It contained a clearance authorization signed by Emperor Velsharak IV, with a date stamp that translated to approximately 6 weeks before the bombardment. It contained a post-clearance verification report confirming complete biological removal, with a completion rate listed as 99.4%, noting that a small number of biological remnants were recovered by transit vessel and removed from the processing zone. That was us. Owen, Clara, the 8 others, a 6%. We were a rounding note in the verification report. My mother's name was not in the file. She was not a name, she was a fraction of a unit count. But she was in there, in the aggregate, in the 1.2 million. She was in the number. And now the number was in my document. I sat with that for a while. Then I made myself read on. Frances found the pattern in year 6. We had been cataloging the administrative template structure of the clearance authorizations, looking for a way to cross-reference documents across different imperial administrative periods when the formatting conventions had changed. She was 3 files deep in a stack of trade authorization documents, looking for a reference code, when she noticed that a certain administrative tag appeared in both clearance authorizations and in a category of economic development permits that had nothing obvious to do with expansion. It took us 3 weeks to untangle it fully. What we found was this: the clearance program was not run exclusively by the Colonial Expansion Division. It was coordinated at the highest imperial level, through a cross-departmental committee that reported directly to the Emperor. The resource extraction that followed each clearance was pre-planned before the clearance was authorized. The worlds were selected not randomly, not because the species living on them presented any threat, but through a systematic resource survey and prioritization process that had been running continuously for over 4,000 years. The species on those worlds were not even considered in the selection criteria. They were simply logged as a variable in the biological interference column and factored into the operational timeline. Frances looked at me across the desk when we had finished confirming this, and she said, very quietly, that this changed things. I asked her what she meant. She said it meant the program was not a series of decisions. It was a machine that had been running so long that the people operating it had forgotten to question whether it should be running at all. I wrote that down. I put it in the document. I attributed it to Frances, because she deserved the credit. By year 10 we had documented 43 species. By year 14, 58. The cases varied enormously. Some species had been cleared from a single world, quickly, with minimal administrative fanfare. Others had been subjects of multi-generational campaigns that moved through their inhabited systems in stages, world by world, over centuries. A few had survived in small numbers as what the Velcairn records called managed remnant populations, kept on reservation territories on lower priority worlds, used occasionally for cultural displays or academic study. Reading those files was among the hardest work I have ever done, not because of the violence in them, which was largely clinical in the language used to describe it, but because of the occasional administrative notation that a particular species had been cooperative during the process. I spent a long time thinking about what cooperation means when the alternative has been made sufficiently clear. During these years, humanity lost 3 more settlements, not colonies on the scale of Kepler's reach. Smaller outposts, research stations, a mining cooperative on a belt asteroid that the Velcairn had decided was more economically efficient to operate without the human presence. The Council filed formal protests with the Galactic Conclave. The Conclave acknowledged receipt. The Velcairn Empire responded through its standard diplomatic automation system with Template 7. Acknowledged. No further correspondence expected. I requested a copy of Template 7 through official channels. I received it. I included it in the document on page 1 of the diplomatic record section. I noted that Template 7 had been sent in response to protests from 14 different species over the preceding 3 centuries. I listed all 14 species. I listed their current status. Of the 14, 9 had been cleared entirely in the years following their protest. 3 existed as managed remnant populations. 2, including humanity, were still extant and technically sovereign. The document grew. Frances and I had stopped counting pages around year 8. We worked by section now, by chapter, by volume. The sourcing index alone was over 40,000 entries. Every claim traced back to an original Velcairn document, to an imperial archive, to a record produced by the Empire's own administrative apparatus. We added nothing that was not documented. We invented nothing. We interpreted as little as possible. We let the record speak. The record, it turned out, had a great deal to say. By year 15 we had confirmed 63 species. The oldest case dated back 3,800 years. A sapient aquatic species on a world that the Velcairn had cleared for deep-sea mineral extraction. The most recent case before Kepler's reach was a small insectoid civilization whose entire inhabited world had been cleared 7 years before the bombardment of our colony, during a period when humanity had been entirely focused on its own interstellar expansion and had not noticed. The total documented population removed across all 63 species, calculated from Velcairn survey data and post-clearance verification figures, was approximately 340 billion individuals. I looked at that number for a very long time. Frances had taken a few weeks away to attend to a family matter, and I was alone in the office on the afternoon I finalized that calculation. The building was quiet. Outside, it was an ordinary day. People were walking past the window, going about their lives, buying food, talking on their devices, living the way people live when they are not thinking about what is possible in the dark between stars. I sat with 340 billion for 20 minutes, then I added it to the document. Then I opened a new section and began writing the cover letter. I knew by then how I would send it. Frances and I had discussed the strategy in detail over the previous 2 years, refining it, stress testing it, anticipating objections and countermoves. The document was not going to be handed to a government. Governments could be pressured. Governments could be threatened into silence. The document was not going to a single news organization or academic institution, because those could be discredited individually, labeled as biased, accused of serving human interests. The document was going to everyone, simultaneously, on every open channel of the Galactic Information Network, to the Conclave, to the Velcairn's own subject species, to their client states, to their academic institutions, to independent civilizations that had maintained cautious neutrality for generations, to Velcairn citizens, to their historians and their ethicists and their young scholars who had grown up inside, A system they had never been given a reason to question. The cover letter took me 3 days to write. 3 days for one paragraph. Every word chosen with the same care I had applied to every sourcing decision in the main document. No anger, no rhetoric, just a statement of what it was and a sentence at the end that I am still proud of. We leave the conclusions to you. I sent a draft to Frances. She read it overnight and called me in the morning. She said it was right. She said to send it. I did not send it yet. There were 2 more things I needed to do. The first was to create distribution redundancy. If the document was going to mean anything, it had to survive any attempt to pull it down. Frances and I spent 3 months building a network of archive nodes, 47 of them, on 14 different worlds, maintained by contacts we had cultivated carefully over the years. Academics and archivists and one very quiet network administrator on a Thren University server who had read a paper I published 4 years earlier about information preservation in conflict zones and had reached out afterward to say it was the most important thing he had read that year. His name was Denvar. He became our 48th node without being fully aware of it. The second thing was simpler. I went to my mother's home district memorial, a small stone marker that had been erected after Kepler's Reach, in a public garden in the city where she had grown up before emigrating to the colony. I sat there for an hour. I did not pray. I am not sure what I did, except that I stayed until I felt something settle, something that had been wound very tight for 18 years, not loosening exactly, but finding its proper tension. Then I stood up, I thanked her, I went back to my office. That night, at 3 in the morning, with Frances present via remote connection and Owen, who had been one of the 12 survivors from Kepler's Reach and had kept loose contact with me over the years, watching silently from an adjoining screen, I sent the document, all 42 volumes, 247,000 source citations, 63 species, 1 cover letter, 1 paragraph, no signature from a president or a general or a diplomat. Just my name, my title, the date, and the truth. The first 3 days were silent. Not peaceful, not calm. Silent in the way a room goes silent when something very large has fallen in the next building, and no one yet knows what it was. Earth's Defense Council moved to elevated readiness within 6 hours of transmission. I attended a briefing where 12 people in various stages of controlled alarm explained to me that I had potentially triggered a military response from the most powerful empire in the known galaxy, and asked me with great restraint whether I had considered that possibility. I told them I had considered it for approximately 18 years, and that I believed the document's reach made direct retaliation politically expensive in a way that purely military strength could not easily overcome. The person asking the question, a defense coordinator named Gregory Hale, who had never particularly liked me, looked at me with an expression only to describe as the face of a man who has just realized the person he is arguing with might be either brilliant or completely unhinged and is not yet sure which. I told him to watch the information network. On the 4th day, the Galactic Conclave requested an emergency plenary session. The request was logged under Procedural Category 9, which was reserved for matters affecting the stability of multiple member civilizations. Category 9 had not been invoked in over 200 years. On the 5th day, the Thren Confederation issued a formal inquiry to the Imperial Court. The Thren were old. They had been part of the Vulcaran alliance structure for 6 centuries. A client relationship they had entered after a period of conflict that their own historical accounts described with a certain selective vagueness. The inquiry was polite, precise, and completely devastating. It cited item 7841 in the attached record, which cross-referenced a Vulcaran mineral extraction report from 380 years prior, with a Thren oral historical account of the destruction of their ancestral homeworld, which they had been told, for 380 years, had been lost to a catastrophic geological event. The Thren inquiry asked, in the careful language of a civilization that had been a dutiful partner for 6 centuries, whether the Emperor's office could clarify the discrepancy. Frances sent me a message when the Thren inquiry was published on the network. The message said, "It is starting." She was right, but the full shape of what was starting was not yet visible. What happened in the next 30 days happened in layers, each one building on the last, each one moving faster than the one before. On day 7, 3 independent academic institutions within the Vulcaran Empire itself published public statements requesting access to the Imperial Archive records, cited in the document for independent verification. This was extraordinary. These institutions operated within the Empire's educational system, which was not a free system in any modern sense. They were not rebels. They were academics, operating by the rules of their profession, asking for the thing that academic professionals are supposed to ask for, the ability to check the sources. The implicit message was enormous. They were not disputing the document. They were asking to confirm it. On day 9, the Morel Compact, a small confederation of 3 species in the outer reaches of Velcaran influence, submitted a formal memorandum to the conclave, noting that the document contained records of survey activity in Morel-adjacent space, predating the current non-aggression agreement, and requesting clarification on whether those surveys had carried biological assessment components. The language was diplomatic and precise. The implication was not subtle. On day 11, the Imperial Diplomatic Service contacted me directly for the first time. Not through the Council, not through any formal governmental channel. Directly. A message addressed to me by name, arriving at my registered academic contact address. The sender was identified as Senior Diplomatic Liaison Verath, Office of External Affairs. The message was courteous. It expressed concern about the potential for the document to cause instability in established interstellar relationships, and invited me, as the document's author, to participate in a process of review, to identify and correct any material inaccuracies before wider misinterpretation could occur. I read the message 3 times, then I replied. I told Liaison Verath that I welcomed the opportunity to correct any factual errors in the document and asked her to specify which claims she believed to be inaccurate, with reference to the relevant source citations, so that I could review and, where warranted, amend the record. She replied within 2 hours. Her reply was also courteous. It did not specify any factual errors. It instead reiterated the concern about instability and widened the invitation to include a private diplomatic meeting. I wrote back. I said I would be glad to participate in any process aimed at accuracy. I said again that I would need her to identify the specific inaccuracies. I asked if she could do that in writing. She did not reply for 11 days. During those 11 days, the conclave convened its first plenary session. I watched the feed from my office, Francis next to me, both of us with coffee that went cold while we watched. The session was procedural, largely, concerned with establishing process rather than outcomes. But 3 things happened that mattered. First, a motion to form an independent investigative panel to review the claims in the document was introduced by the Thren delegation and seconded by 2 other member delegations. Second, the motion passed a preliminary procedural vote with enough support to advance to a full vote. Third, the Velcaran delegation, for the first time in the conclave's recorded history, requested a postponement rather than an immediate vote. They cited a need for additional time to prepare a response. A postponement request from the Velcaran Empire, 4,000 years old, the most powerful single political entity in the known galaxy, and they needed more time to figure out what to say. Gregory Hale called me that evening. He did not apologize exactly. He said, "I am beginning to think you are brilliant rather than unhinged." I told him the distinction might not matter as much as he thought. On day 23, Liaison Verath called me, not a written message, a live audio connection, which was unusual and which I recorded with her awareness. She was professional, she was precise, and she was, for the first time, something I had not expected, slightly uncomfortable. The tone of a person who has been given a task that she knows is not going to go the way her superiors intend. She said the Empire was prepared to acknowledge that certain historical records had been maintained in formats that could be subject to misinterpretation by parties not fully familiar with imperial administrative conventions. She said the Empire was willing to issue a clarifying statement that would provide context for the materials referenced in the document. I asked whether this clarifying statement would identify any factual errors in the document. She paused for a moment. Then she said that the purpose of the statement would be to provide context, rather than to dispute specific claims. I said that I understood. I said that context was always valuable. I said that if the statement was issued, I would read it carefully and consider whether it warranted any additions to the document's editorial notes section. Another pause. She asked whether I intended to continue distributing the document. I told her the document had been distributed to 847 archive nodes across 14 worlds, and was currently available on the Open Galactic Information Network. I told her that removing it was not within my capability, even if I wished to do so, which I did not. The silence that followed lasted 11 seconds. I counted. Then she thanked me for my time and disconnected. Francis let out a long breath beside me. She said, "They have nothing. They have absolutely nothing." I said, "They have their resources and their fleet and 4,000 years of institutional momentum." She said yes, but they do not have a single factual error they can point to, and in a galaxy that is now watching, that is the only thing that would help them. She was right. And within a week the galaxy made clear that it was watching. The conclave full vote was scheduled. The motion to establish an independent investigative panel passed. Not unanimously, not easily, but it passed. For the first time in 4 centuries, the Galactic Conclave had voted to investigate the Volcaran Empire. Not because of a war, not because of a military threat, because of a document that a human archivist had assembled from the Empire's own public records and sent to everyone at 3 in the morning. I sat in my office after the vote result was announced and I looked at the wall for a while. Owen sent me a message. He had been following the whole thing from a distance. The way he had followed most things since Kepler's breach, carefully and quietly, and without wanting to get too close to the center of it. His message said, "Clara watched the vote with me. She said to tell you she counted the votes and you won." I wrote back and told him to thank her. I told him the count was not finished yet. It was not. The hardest part was coming. The 40 warships arrived at the edge of Earth's solar system at 0600 on a Thursday morning, 17 days after the conclave vote. I was informed by a council security officer who knocked on my door in person, which is how I knew it was serious. When things are fine, they send messages. When warships appear, they knock. I got dressed. I went to the council building. I sat in a briefing room with Gregory Hale and 11 other people and watched the tracking display update in real time as the fleet held position at the system's edge and transmitted their demand. The demand was straightforward. Surrender the document and its author for processing. Withdraw all copies from the information network within 48 hours. Issue a formal retraction on all conclave channels. Gregory looked at me. I looked at the display. I said they did not come to attack us. If they were going to attack us, they would have moved on Earth first and transmitted afterward. They are broadcasting on open channels because they want the conclave to see this. They are trying to create an ultimatum that forces the conclave to back down. He asked how certain I was of that. I said I was not entirely certain. But I noted that 200 warships had taken Kepler's reach in 6 hours, and 40 warships sent to retrieve a document, and its author was not a military calculation. It was a political one. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked what we should do. I said nothing. For now, watch. The 48-hour window passed. Earth did not retract the document because it was not Earth's document to retract, and no formal governmental entity had issued it. This was something the Volcaran diplomatic team appeared not to have fully anticipated. The author of the document was a private citizen with an academic title. There was no mechanism by which the council could compel retraction, even if they had wished to. And they did not wish to, because the conclave was watching, and retracting the document now would have been the loudest possible admission that the document was accurate. On the second day, the Thren Confederation moved a fleet of their own into the outer system, not between Earth and the Volcaran warships but adjacent, visible on the tracking displays, announced publicly to the conclave as an observation presence under the terms of the new investigative resolution. The Thren fleet commander transmitted on open channel that any action against a conclave member world while an active investigative process was underway would be considered a procedural violation requiring immediate review. It was not a declaration of protection. It was a procedural note. In the language of galactic diplomacy, it was the difference between a drawn weapon and a hand placed firmly on the door. The Volcaran fleet held position. 2 days later, the Murel Compact announced the dispatch of their own observation vessels. 2 days after that, a small but very vocal species called the Veshan, who had been openly critical of Volcaran expansion for decades, but had never had anything but their own voice to support the criticism, sent a message to the conclave formally endorsing the investigative panel and noting that they were delighted to provide archive support to any member species requiring secure document hosting. I received a personal message from the Veshan cultural minister, a long and rather enthusiastic communication that included the observation that humanity had done in 18 years what their species had been trying to do for 300, and that the difference appeared to be that we had organized our evidence rather than our outrage. I kept that letter. It is in the archive. On the 9th day of the standoff, a Volcaran intelligence operative attended a diplomatic reception held at the Conclave Liaison building in the capital. She was using legitimate credentials as a trade consultant attached to the Imperial Commercial Delegation, which was still technically active. She was very good. She moved through the event quietly, professionally, speaking to people and making notes and building a picture of the evening. And then she came and stood next to me near the refreshments table. She said my name, my full name. She said it correctly, which told me she had done her research. She was tall, gray-skinned with those wide, pale eyes, and she looked at me with an expression that was not hostile. It was something closer to genuine curiosity. She said, "You are not a soldier." I said I was not. She said, "You have no military training, no intelligence background. You are an archivist." I said that was correct. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "What kind of archivist does this?" I said, "The kind whose mother was in a column labeled units removed." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with something I would not have expected from an Imperial intelligence operative, that she had read portions of the document, that she had found it very complete. I thanked her. I said I had worked hard on the sourcing. She was detained by Earth security 40 minutes later. They had been watching her since she arrived. I had mentioned to Gregory Hale's team that I expected a personal approach. He had not believed me, but he had prepared anyway. I was questioned afterward. I told them everything. I included the conversation in the document's editorial log. I noted that she had found it very complete. I noted that she did not deny a single figure. The Velcairn fleet withdrew on day 17. No announcement, no statement. The ships simply began their fold-up sequence and disappeared one by one until the tracking display was clear. Gregory Hale was in the room when it happened. He watched the last marker vanish from the display, and then he sat back in his chair and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "How did you know they would not fire?" I said I did not know. I said I had calculated the probability as low, based on the political cost and the conclave visibility, and the fact that the document existed in 847 nodes, and was not recoverable through any action against Earth or against me. I said removing me would have done nothing except add one more line to the document. He said that was a lot of probability to bet on. I said, I have been betting on it for 18 years. He did not argue with that. Frances came to see me that evening. She brought food, something warm, and we sat in my office and ate and did not talk about the fleet or the conclave or the investigative panel. We talked about ordinary things. She told me about her daughter's school performance. I told her about a book I had been reading, an old one, a novel set on Earth's oceans that had nothing to do with any of this. We sat in the quiet of the office that had been the center of 18 years of work, and we let the work rest for one evening. Before she left, she said, "What comes next?" I said the long part, the part where nothing is quick and everything is contested, and the documents get read aloud in a chamber in front of 400 species, and the Empire has to sit there while their own administrative records are recited back to them line by line. She said, "Are you ready for that?" I thought about my mother. I thought about Owen and Clara in the maintenance tunnel. I thought about 340 billion individuals in a column with no names, and about the Thren minister who had found out his people's home world had not been destroyed by nature, and about a Velcairn intelligence operative saying the document was very complete with an expression that was not what I had expected. I told Frances I had been ready for 8 years and that the readiness had not diminished. She nodded. She left. I turned back to my desk, and I opened the second volume of the document, the one covering surviving displaced species, the ones who had not been fully cleared, who existed now in fragments and remnants and managed populations across the Empire's territories. There were names in this volume, too. Species names and individual names and place names for worlds they had been removed from. I had been building this volume quietly alongside the main record. Now that the main record had done its work, this one needed to be finished. I worked through the night. The city was quiet outside my window. Somewhere across the stars, the most powerful empire in recorded galactic history was sitting with a conclave investigation on its hands, and a document in its name that 847 archive nodes would serve to anyone who asked, and the knowledge that firing on Earth would add nothing and change nothing, except the mood of every species that was already watching. I wrote, I counted, I kept the record. That was what I did. That was what I had always done. I am old now. The kind of old that is not dramatic but is very thorough. My joints remind me of their presence each morning. I read without glasses still, which I consider a reasonable trade. I drink my coffee too early and stay at my desk too long, and my assistant, a young woman named Penny, who is 24 and sharp in all the ways that matter, tells me regularly that I need to rest more. I tell I rested for 6 months after the tribunal, and that it nearly finished me. She does not believe this. She might be right. The conclave tribunal convened 8 years after I sent the document. 8 years of procedural preparation, of evidence and submission, of the Empire's legal team filing objection after objection to the panel's composition, to the scope of the investigation, to the admissibility of documents that were, as I kept noting in my own submissions, drawn exclusively from the Empire's own public archives. The objections were handled one by one, patiently, by a panel that had been selected with enormous care and that included, notably, 3 members from species that had no historical grievance with the Velcarine and therefore could not be accused of bias. The Empire had requested those members, thinking neutral parties would be more sympathetic. This was not correct. Testified for 6 hours. I did not deliver a speech. I am not a speechmaker. I read from the document, starting from the beginning, in the order I had constructed it, with the oldest case first. I read in Velcarin, because that was the language in which the records had been created, and I wanted no translation errors. The simultaneous interpretation fed into the conclave's universal speaker system and went to 400 attending delegations and to a live broadcast on the Galactic Information Network. The Velcarin delegation was present. The Emperor himself was not. He had sent 4 representatives, all senior officials, all composed, all maintaining the particular stillness of people who have been trained to show nothing. I looked at them occasionally while I read. I did not look for a reaction. I looked to acknowledge that they were there. They were part of the record, too. At the end of my testimony, one of the conclave's senior members, a representative of the Ashan, one of the oldest species in the conclave, who had maintained cautious neutrality with the Empire for centuries and was known for saying very little, asked if she could make a brief statement. The chair allowed it. She turned toward me and said something that I had not expected and that I have never figured out how to respond to adequately. She said every civilization in this chamber knew. We knew what the Empire was doing. We knew for generations. We looked away because looking away felt survivable, and looking clearly felt like standing in the path of something too large to stop. You are a young species. You arrived in the galaxy when we were already tired of the sight of this, and you did the thing that the rest of us had decided was too costly. You counted. She paused, then she said, "We should have counted first," I said. "You can count now. It is not too late to count." She nodded once she sat down. The panel deliberated for 4 months. The verdict, when it came, was not a sudden collapse of anything. People expect empires to fall like buildings, in a single dramatic moment with noise and visible impact. That is not what happened. What happened was a series of conclusions that each required an administrative response, and those responses each required further negotiations, and those negotiations each produced incremental outcomes that only looked transformative when you stood back far enough to see the whole shape. Reparation proceedings were opened for 11 surviving displaced species. The process was expected to take decades. It did, and does, and will, but it is real and it is happening, and there are species alive today who are receiving resources and recognition for losses that were denied and hidden and filed under biological interference for centuries. The expansion program was suspended under mandatory conclave monitoring. Not ended, technically. But the monitoring requirement meant that any new clearance authorization would now require independent review before execution. In practice, this was the end of the program. The machine stopped because the machine required secrecy to operate without friction, and the document had permanently removed that secrecy. Emperor Velsharik IV abdicated 19 months after the verdict. The official statement cited health reasons. The medical records were not made public. I noted in the document's appendix that this was the first imperial abdication in 400 years and left the interpretation to the reader. The reform faction within the Velcarin Empire had been a quiet presence for over a century, a movement of academics and ethicists and younger officials who believed the expansion program was both morally unsupportable and strategically self-defeating. They had lacked evidence that was clean enough, sourced enough, undeniable enough to use in internal political arguments. The document gave them that. Within 3 years of the tribunal, 2 of their representatives were in formal governmental positions. Within a decade, 5, the change was slow. Change inside a 4,000-year-old institution is always slow. But it was not reversible. They asked humanity for copies of my archive. We sent them. All 42 volumes, plus the second volume I had finished during the years between the fleet's withdrawal and the tribunal. We kept the originals in 47 archive nodes. We added 63 more nodes in the years that followed. The document now exists in 847 locations across the galaxy and is freely available to any network-connected device. It has been downloaded more times than I can track. That is as it should be. I was asked often, in the years after the tribunal, what humanity intended to do with its new standing in the galactic community, whether we would build a fleet commensurate with our influence, whether we would seek a permanent senior seat on the conclave, whether we would use what we had accomplished as the foundation for a power structure of our own. I answered these questions honestly. I said I did not know what humanity would build. I said that was not my decision, and that I was glad it was not my decision. What I had built was a record, not a throne. Records do not govern, they inform. What governance came from the information was the work of people who were better suited to governance than I am. What I know is this: we were a young species in a very old galaxy. We had been present in interstellar spaces for barely 2 centuries when Kepler's reach was taken. We had no fleet that could match the empires, no ancient alliances, no accumulated political weight from centuries of negotiated relationships. We had the thing that young species have when they are too new to have learned to look away yet. We had the capacity to be outraged by something that older species had absorbed so thoroughly that it no longer registered as outrageable. That is what the document was, not a weapon, not a threat, not a declaration of anything except the facts. It was the product of one person who was too stubborn or too grieving or too particular about the record to accept that the facts did not matter because the empire was too large for facts to touch. The facts touched, organized carefully, with patience, with sufficient footnotes, given freely to everyone who might be moved by them, and some who would not, and a few who had never been given permission to be moved before, and were grateful for the permission. The facts did what facts do when no one is allowed to hide them anymore. They held. Penny brought me tea this morning and stood in the doorway and said there was a delegation from one of the newly recognized displaced species requesting an appointment. They wanted to discuss a memorial project. They wanted to know if I would help them identify the original name of their homeworld, the name before the Empire's administrative designation replaced it. They had heard I might have it somewhere in the archive. I told her to schedule the appointment. I turned to my terminal. I opened the search function. I typed in the administrative reference number for their species. It came up immediately. The record was 4 pages long. Near the bottom, in a biological survey field that the survey team had filled in almost as an afterthought, there was a single notation. It said, species designation self-reported in local language as a multi-syllable vocalization. Colonial surveyors transliteration approximate. And there, in an imperial administrative document over 9 centuries old, was the name, their name, the one they had given their world, the one that had been filed and forgotten, and buried under centuries of processing notation and resource extraction reports and procedural language. And that had survived all of it, simply because a bureaucrat on a survey team had been thorough enough to write it down. I wrote it out. I double-checked the transliteration against other phonetic records in the archive. Then I printed it and I held the paper in my hand, and I thought about what it means to keep a record, what it means to write something down when the world is not watching, and no one has asked you to, and the only reason you are doing it is because it is true. And truth is the only thing that outlasts the things that try to erase it. I thought about the maintenance tunnel, and the 11 people, and the coffee mug with the coastline on it. I thought about 18 years at a desk. I thought about Owen's message. She counted the votes and you won. I thought about my mother. I thought about her name in a column. I thought about the fact that her name was also in my document, in the dedication which I had added in the final edit with no explanation, just her name in full, and the date she was born, and the date the Empire took her. I folded the paper carefully. I put it in an envelope. I addressed it to the delegation and marked it for Penny to send. Then I turned back to my terminal. There was more work to do. There was always more work to do. There are species in the archive whose names are still incomplete, whose histories are still partially obscured, whose worlds still carry only administrative designations in the public record. I intend to find all of them. I intend to write them all down. The Velcairn Emperor took human lives. He received a message in return, not a threat, not a declaration, not a weapon, a record. Complete, sourced, immovable, assembled with patience and discipline from the Empire's own words, organized by someone who had decided that if the truth was going to matter, someone had to be the one to carry it. And it turned out that the truth, organized carefully, with patience and sufficient footnotes, is the thing that ends empires. I am still here. I am still counting.